Hey everyone, how are you today? This is a little bit of a different schedule this week because there's no technical remote day this week. So, Group A, I saw you guys in person today here on November 2nd, and we took notes over the end of Chapter 5, Section 3 about Rockefeller and JP Morgan. And my expectation is that on Tuesday, if you want to work ahead, but it's your day off, you could do nothing. Or on Wednesday, you're going to watch this lecture, take notes, complete the exit slip that goes along with it, and you're going to do your Pullman strike assignment and get that done by Thursday by the time you come to class. And also bring your supplies of, a ruler and glue and scissors if you have it. And if you're Group B, if you're watching this video, I would probably hold off until I've seen you on Wednesday in person. And Wednesday, finish up the lecture from Chapter 5, Section 3, and then move to this lecture. Watch it on Thursday, take your notes, and then complete your Pullman strike assignment, and then I'll see you again on Friday, and then you'll be bringing your supplies of scissors, glue, ruler for Friday. But it's up to you. So this section is about Chapter 5, Section 4, and what we're going to be talking about is what are labor unions, and why do people create a labor union? What is the goal of a labor union? Why did people go on strike? What were some of the famous strikes of the Gilded Age? Were they successful? And we're going to be specifically focusing on the Pullman strike, and that's what your homework is going to be about. So what you're looking at in the picture is these are men who are most likely meeting at kind of a labor union meeting. And a labor union is basically the call for an organization where men could come together, and I know that sounds gender biased, but it's true. Mostly men could come together and they would work towards changing their working environment because the government was not involved, because obviously America is this laissez-faire capitalist economic system, so it's focused on profit and private property. And as first stated by Adam Smith, the idea was that the American government should not tell employers how to treat their employees or how much to charge for products or how much to pay their employees, and it would work out the best for everyone, that the employers would make money and that employees would be treated decently overall, and the average American consumer, would be only buying products that were well made and, priced at a decent price. But in reality, although capitalism sounds great in practice, it really only was effective for the people who were rich. And the vast majority of Americans were poor. There was this huge gap. We started to see a rising middle class with, people taking management jobs, and if people inherited some money from their family, perhaps. But still, the average annual income for most Americans hovered around $350 to $400 per year, which was well below poverty. And as people were expected to work 6 days a week, they found that to be completely unfair. If you start your job at 7 a.m. and you go to 7 p.m., it doesn't give a lot of time for rest or relaxation or doing chores or seeing your family, especially on the weekend. You don't get to sleep in. You don't get to get projects done around the house, nothing of that nature. And, people really felt like they were missing out and they were physically exhausted. It'd be different if they were compensated for their work. But, during this time period, we're going to see early on in the Gilded Age, factory workers making $1 a day to $1.20, $1.50, and skilled men making maybe $2 a day. Women, of course, were being paid half as much. It was a very biased society, and they assumed that women were just working while they were single to, help out their family, or if they were married, they would perhaps let some women work while they were married, especially immigrant women, if the family was destitute or if she was a widow. But then she would only be paid a fraction of that. So if the man's getting paid, $1.50, she's going to make maybe 70 cents, maybe 75. And it was so, difficult for so many immigrants coming to America. They were often discriminated against, and they got the worst jobs. They might even be paid less because of, their ethnic background, the way that they smelled, the way that they looked, the way that they sounded. And yeah, African Americans were, of course, perhaps paid less as well and given the worst jobs. This is a time period, remember, where we see the Jim Crow laws are in place that legalize segregation. Homer Plessy during this time period, remember, is the man who looked white, but his grandparent was black. He tried to buy the white train car ticket. They sold it to him, but then when the conductor checked his identity card, he realized he was part black. He asked him to move the black car. He said no. It went to court, and the Supreme Court was racist, and they ruled that segregation of the races was legal. They said separate but equal is fine, and that set off this whole legalized segregation all the way until the 1950s, when things start to change and we start to see eventually Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement come about. But it was a very difficult time, during the Gilded Age for the average American, where African Americans and immigrants and women are being paid less. And for immigrants who are coming to America, they might have to have their children work, maybe at least an 8-hour workday. And of course, those children got tired during the day. Accidents were more likely to happen. Employers will continue to hire children because they loved kids. They were small. They could fit in between the machines. They could fix them if they broke. In the beginning of the day, they were tended to be quick and energetic and happy. But as kids got tired and the day wore on, they often stuck their hands in a machine to unjam it. And then that's when the accident would occur because they were getting tired and not paying attention as much. And yeah, they'd lose a finger, they'd lose a hand. And if it was a nice employer, they would give them a few days off for rest, recuperation, pay their doctor's bills. But this isn't like a time period of medical insurance or disability or workman's compensation. And so you were kind of on your own. You don't have health care or anything like that. But for the most part, employers liked hiring kids. They liked hiring women. They liked that basically women were doing just as much work as men, especially if it was a factory job, and they got to pay them half as much, claiming that they could do so because, men deserve more money to feed their families. And people kept coming back because they needed to put food on the table, as difficult as it was. And the conditions were dangerous. Women with long hair, there's stories of them getting their hair caught in the machine, which I think I've told you before, and losing their scalp and losing body parts. And it was difficult and hot and dangerous. So what you see in this meeting is men who've come together, and they're just pushing for, they want, basically shorter hours, better pay, safer conditions. They're not even asking for health care or anything outrageous at this point, and not that health care even is outrageous either. But they really were not given a minimum wage like we have today, or vacation or sick days or any kind of job security. So they decided to organize into a labor union, this organization where they're going to fight for better rights and for safer conditions and better pay and shorter hours. Those are really the three demands. They would pay money into the union each month, and then the union would basically have representatives who would get some of that money, and they would use their spare time to come up with arguments for the boss as to why they should get better pay or shorter hours or safer conditions. They would, after the workday was over, meet with the boss and try to come up with some kind of deal or compromise. And then they would even threaten to go on strike as a unit, if they did not receive higher pay. In reality, though, they're never going to get it. They would end up making picket signs like you see, standing outside their organization, going on strike. And many employers got smart, and they're like, they're striking outside. I'm going to lock the doors. I'm going to fire them. I'm going to blacklist them, put them on a list so no one hires them again. I'm going to get new employees to come in the back door and take their jobs, and I'll force the new employees to sign these yellow dog contracts promising to never join a union or to strike. And these people were out of a job. Over time, members of unions, if they decide to go on strike, they will realize the importance of a sit-in, to just sit inside the factory and refuse to leave so they can't be replaced. But this is basically why labor unions come about, because the working conditions are so difficult, and the relationship between employers and employee was very hard during this time period. And the government does not step in to change the situation, feeling it's not their place. And remember, as you go through, these are your notes. Feel free to write down as much as you want. I'll be posting these here probably at the end of the week. So this will wrap up chapter 5, though, this section 4. So what basically happens is that some people join labor unions to try to bring about change in their capitalist economic system. But some people get very angry because even though they've joined a labor union, they've gone on strike, no change is happening. As I said, some of the robber barons and these factory owners simply replace them, with people who are willing to work for less money, who are homeless, who are unemployed, who are immigrants who've just come to America and they don't realize that the wages are ridiculously low compared to everyone else. Perhaps it's still better than what they were making at home. And so some people start saying, we need to totally change our economic system. We need to move away from capitalism to something new. And at the bottom of the screen, if you notice, I have this image which really kind of explains everything clearly if you don't want to write down anything at the top. We have capitalism, an economic system focused on private property. People can own the means of production, meaning they can open up their own factory. And it might be a small lemonade stand, and it might be a huge corporation like Facebook or Adidas or Under Armour. but decisions are made by people themselves. The government has very little involvement. That's what true laissez-faire capitalism is. And it's not like the government tells us where to shop or how much to buy or how much to pay for goods. In recent years, of course, there is a minimum wage since the 1930s telling employers how much to pay employees. But that's about it. And there's some regulations for safety standards. But in general, you can make a profit, as obviously some of these people, have. Now, some people start advocating on the opposite end of the spectrum for communism and for socialism. I'll start with communism, then I'll kind of work my way back. Now, communism is articulated by a man by the name of Karl Marx. And Karl Marx was living in Germany, and him and a friend write the Communist Manifesto. And the manifesto is, it's your mantra, it's your statement, it's your beliefs, it's your ideology, it's your goals. And he basically said, if you look at the history of the world, it's a history of class struggles, of one social class constantly fighting against another social class, like slaves trying to get out of slavery in American history. Or if you look all the way back to the Middle Ages, with like lords and knights and castles, you had these peasant farmers called serfs. And they were basically slaves because they had to work the land to gain protection from the nobles. They would hide in the castles in case like the Vikings or someone invaded. And he said that eventually they, overthrew their masters and got freedom. Also because of time changed with, the bubonic plague and things like that, the Black Death. But he says there's always going to be a revolution if there is not equality. And so he advocated a system where everyone was equal, where there was no rich, there was no poor. Everyone would be the same. And it sounds great in a way because there's no mega rich people, there's no robber barons, there's no more Rockefeller with 1.4 billion, and everybody has the same amount of money, so sounds awesome. But the problem with it is that you need some kind of initial government to be in control to make sure that all the money is being divided out equally. And the idea was the government would own the major industries like the railroad industry, the steel industry, the oil industries. Because if it's that important and everyone uses it, why have one person own it and have all the profits? The idea was that, the government would perhaps own things and control things and make sure everyone was equal and help everyone to get a job. And eventually, perhaps the government need would kind of melt away and people would just naturally want to share and care for each other and share food and live in these happy little farm communes. That was the thought process. So it sounds great because everybody's going to be equal, but it also sounds bad in a sense that you're never going to be rewarded for your own inventions or originality. You're never going to, become rich if you're talented, if you're smart, if you're determined. If you have something special that you want to create or do, you're very limited in what you can do with it. You have to basically try to give your idea to the government, and they might, give you financial rewards for it, but probably not. It doesn't really give you any incentive to work hard. And it also takes away your personal freedom because the government is pretty much controlling things for a while and telling you what to do and where to shop and how much to pay and what can be produced and how much employees should be paid. So, especially compared to our American values, it sounds terrible. So, most Americans weren't like hardcore, yeah, let's become a communist country. They were more so supporting the idea of socialism in the middle. A socialist system would be one where the government controls the major industries like steel and oil and railroads and things of that nature, healthcare, schools, but it's a mixture of capitalism and communism, hence why it's in the middle, and you still have the ability to open up your own individual store. If you want a shoe store or a lemonade stand, you can do that. And people still get to make their own personal decisions about what they buy and where they shop and how much they, buy. And, there's still a lot more personal freedom. So it's a mixture. So some people were attracted to this because if you're living in America where you're making $1.10 a day and you're busting your butt every day, in a society where people are more equal in terms of economic wealth and the government is going to watch out for you and protect you and keep you safe, but you can still open your business, hey, sounded pretty good. Definitely sounded pretty good. And some people said the system was broken, it was time to overthrow it, and it's going to gain some support. And so we're seeing that some people are going to see the creation of this new political party, which of course still exists to this day. Now, if this concept seems a little overwhelming, don't worry yet. Communism and socialism will continue to come back to all year because, of course, you get China, which is communist, and North Korea, and, you get other countries which are socialist to this day. So it's important that you understand those concepts so they kind of define our relationship with those nations. So we'll come back to this kind of again later, so not to worry yet if it still seems a bit overwhelming. But just think about it for now. People would enjoy it or perhaps think it was right for us because they were so poor and they were struggling. Now, some people become communist or socialist in America. Not that many communists, more socialists. We'll even see a socialist political candidate for the presidency in 1912. I think there's a socialist candidate on the ballot for this election as well. I can't remember. I voted Friday, and I remember seeing Kanye West's name on the ballot. It's legit on there. And I think there was a socialist candidate now that I think of it. So some people join socialism or communism, but other people simply join their local union. And their union is going to be holding those meetings like you saw in that first picture and trying to push for change. So the first national labor union in the entire United States is called the National Labor Union. Big surprise, right, in terms of its name. And it was a national union, meaning anybody in the country could join it if they worked for the government. They were racist. They refused to admit African Americans. This was still in the years right after the Civil War, so the country was still very tense. But African Americans were forced to create their own CNLU called the Colored National Labor Union. I have some abbreviations there, the AA being African Americans. The National Labor Union, besides being a bit of a racist organization early on, ultimately did have some successes, which was to convince Congress to legalize an 8-hour workday for government employees. So that would be like somebody who works for the post office or somebody who has a government contract to resurface the roads. My husband works for the Army Corps of Engineers as builder, basically repairing levees and dams and bridges. Any of those government type jobs, it's now an 8-hour workday. So it is a step in the right direction. Some groups, the government being one of them, is willing to make compromises. And, in this case, it wasn't better pay, but it was at least a shorter day. Now, another early labor union that's important is the Knights of Labor. It's not really made up of knights like you see in my picture there. And this was a union early on that was created for members of the garment industry. So it had some women in there. Mostly it was men, though. We're talking about people who, do they sew clothes? Do they cut cloth? Do they weave? Whatever it is they do. Most of the clothing that Americans buy now comes from overseas. You think about it being made in sweatshops. But years ago, clothes were mostly made in America. And those factory jobs obviously have now moved out of the country at this point as companies have moved overseas to try to find cheaper labor to save money. But this Knights of Labor group was made up of skilled and unskilled workers. So it didn't matter if you actually were a skilled tailor, who could, fix clothing, or if you were a janitor at the factory who swept the floor. Anyone who basically worked for the garment or textile industry could join. They opposed child labor and poor factory conditions, but unfortunately there's not a whole lot of change that they are able to create. In fact, the Knights of Labor has some problems. There's some fighting between the skilled and the unskilled laborers. There's in fact a year of violent strikes in American history, and the Knights of Labor are involved in that. During this year of violent strikes called the Great Upheaval, many of the strikes turned violent, where the police are called in because the strikers, basically the company owner wants the employees to go back to work, the employees refuse, the employee owner calls in the cops and kind of puts pressure on the people, and that, hopefully the people will surrender, go back to work because they'll be afraid for their lives or getting arrested. And sometimes the scare tactics work, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes people become pretty much anarchists who are against the government, and they throw bombs at the police and the factory, and things get out of control. We saw some violent, strikes that year, and as people basically attack the police attack back. That's no surprise. We've seen a lot of protests and violence by the police and by protesters this year in America. And so, yeah, basically that's what's going to be happening here in this Great Upheaval year, and eventually it leads to a division of the Knights of Labor. Many people end up leaving the Knights of Labor. A man by the name of Sam Gompers, he's important. See him there under American Federation. He leaves and he creates a union for just skilled workers called the American Federation of Labor. They wanted to get away from being called anarchists or communists or socialists. They don't want to be associated with the unskilled workers from the Great Upheaval. And their union is pretty effective. They're able to go on strike and they end up getting some higher wages and shorter work hour weeks, so they're pretty effective. The last union to mention here is the American Railway Union. That one was created by a man by the name of Eugene Debs, and he's important. He's part of the Pullman strike. He actually runs for the presidency as the socialist candidate in 1912. He's the one I was thinking of before. This union is massive. It's composed of all skilled and unskilled railway workers. So it doesn't matter if you're the conductor on the train and you punch the tickets, that's not really skilled. Or, are you the engineer? Do you drive the train? It's composed of all those employees. And it's going to be a huge union. And when they go on strike, it's going to really impact the United States in terms of really kind of shutting it down, because that's how goods and people moved, during this time period, despite the creation of early cars and planes. Now, let's talk about some of the most famous strikes. We talked about some of the most famous labor unions already. Let's talk about some of the most famous strikes. One of the most famous strikes happens in Chicago, and you'll hear it called the Haymarket Riot or the Haymarket Affair. It's the same thing. Basically, people who worked for McCormick Harvester plant, they were on strike for safer conditions and specifically higher pay. McCormick was a very wealthy company. They made McCormick's Harvester and Reaper and all sorts of farm equipment. They tended to give John Deere a run for their money as far as a competitor. And yeah, the employees knew that the company was making bank, and so they created a labor union, went on strike for higher pay, safer conditions. The strike went on for days. The employer was not too happy about this and the image that it was creating for him. He called in the police. The police used force to kind of get the strikers out of the street. They were blocking traffic. They were moving into Haymarket Square, which was kind of the neighborhood and just the location close to the factory. And basically the cops start shooting at the strikers. One of the strikers ends up getting killed. The next day, one of the strikers retaliates by throwing a bomb at the cops to basically get revenge for the striker's death who died. And then the police basically, once the bomb is aimed at the police officer and he's injured, the cops start shooting at the strikers. And as you can imagine, it's chaos. And the news media, in Chicago where this occurred, are split on this event. And some obviously, feel that the strikers are well, allowed to do what they're doing because they're trying to bring about change and get better wages. And other people feel like the strikers are communists, people who want just government control of everything and total equality, but they're also anarchists, they're against government, they're troublemakers. And so it starts to turn people away from, the strikers and helping them and getting higher pay. And yet again, it also helps that a lot of these robber barons pay off newspapers to print stories, and only in one perspective. Now, the other famous strike we've kind of talked about before, and I posted a video clip about this as well with the exit slip. So obviously you're watching this lecture, it's with the exit slip. If you want, you can also watch the video clip about the Homestead strike, but you don't have to. And you are going to watch the video clip, though, at the end about, are we living in a second Gilded Age, a Gilded Age 2.0, a technical Gilded Age, and you'll use that information to kind of, with your own opinion, answer the last question on the exit slip. But this Homestead strike we've talked about before, that the steelworkers in Carnegie, Pennsylvania steel plant, they go on strike for higher pay, for safer conditions, for shorter hours, but mostly for higher pay. Carnegie is unwilling to meet with them or to allow management to give them more money. They go on strike. Carnegie talks about blacklisting them, yellow dog contracting new employees, so basically kicking out the old employees and firing them, putting them on a list so no one else hires them, forcing new employees to sign a yellow dog contract saying they'll never join a union or strike. And before all of that can really happen, the strikers are incredibly smart, and they basically know that they have to kind of stand their ground. At the same time, Carnegie is incredibly smart, and he brings in basically people to handle the strike, professionals, so to speak. The strike's going to end up turning very violently, and we're going to see people getting injured, and the workers are not successful. They do not get their demands met, and if they want to keep their job, they basically have to beg for it and go back to work and not get higher pay. And so this definitely does not cast Carnegie in a positive light. It definitely makes him look more of, more of a robber baron than, a hero by any means. But it definitely kind of shows us there were so many issues here in America, and it's really an interesting video clip if you watch it, so you can kind of see, where everyone kind of positioned themselves to kind of hold their ground during a strike. But most of the time, the police ended up getting called in. Last major strike to talk about, this is the one that relates to your homework. So you're going to be doing your homework assignment about the Pullman strike, where you're going to be looking at both perspectives of the Chicago Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune, and finding facts to figure out and determine, which newspaper supports strikers, which one supports Pullman. And there's also a video clip that goes along with that, which really helps explain what's going on. But basically, George Pullman produced luxury sleeping cars so that if you want to travel across America, you could travel in style and comfort and sleep on the train. And he didn't pay his employees like a ton of money, but he wasn't like a total robber baron either. He was actually kind of a good guy, and he felt bad for his employees that they lived in these tenements, these slum apartment buildings with no bathrooms, no running water, no parks for their kids to play. The cities were overcrowded and they were just dumps, and there's no fire departments, there's no hospitals nearby, there's just nothing. They started to modernize cities, especially like Chicago after the Great Chicago Fire took it out, but in general they're rough. So near Chicago, he builds this town of Pullman, Illinois, and it has a church and a stable and a school and markets and even a theater and libraries and a playground and all sorts of stuff. And so that way they can kind of live close to their place of employment and have a nice, clean living space. And for the most part, people were very happy. But it is kind of a messed up system because he pays you your wages and then you in turn have to pay him rent. So it is definitely a different system. Now, what's going to end up happening is that in 1893, there's an economic panic. In 1893, Reading Railroad and another railroad company basically made bad investments. They end up going out of business, and it really shakes people's faith in America because railroads, for about 20, 25 years, they'd been big business. They'd been built all over the country. People have been investing in railroads. They bought a lot of stock in the railroads. They didn't realize that these companies were not doing well. They should have sold their stock earlier. And then when the company goes under, the price of the stock just plummets, and a lot of people lose money. And not to mention the fact that you've got all these people who are unemployed. It made people question kind of the stock market in general. People started selling their stock. No one was willing to buy it except for at a low price. And it kind of set off, this whole economic recession or slowdown. The rich really stopped traveling. And as people stopped kind of traveling and going out to eat and started changing their behaviors, companies were not, selling as many products. They were losing out on money, which led to even more layoffs. And then this cycle kind of continued. And it ended up affecting many, many people. George Pullman did not need to make as many, railroad sleeping cars since people were not traveling. And basically, he ends up laying off about 3,000 workers, and the rest of his people, he ends up cutting their wages anywhere from 25 to 50% to deal with his economic depression so he doesn't go out of business. Now, granted, he still had a lot of money in the bank, and he was still incredibly wealthy. Now, here's the thing. He cut the wages, but he never lowered the prices on rents. And so people are like, this is crazy. Like, you're paying me barely enough to cover my rent, and then how am I supposed to have food or medical supplies or any recreation or savings? And there's no Social Security or retirement program back then, so you had to save on your own. And so basically, the people decide they're going to meet with him. Pullman is refusing to deal with the situation or to help them out, so they decide to go on strike. And at first, it was just a little local strike of the employees in Pullman, Illinois. But they contact Eugene Debs, who is a socialist and who's head of the American Railway Union for the entire country. And he says, you know what? I'm going to get all of the railroad employees in America to go on strike because, they're important and the railroad is vital for sending goods and for sending people, and people need to get paid more money. And this should have been happening for a long time. And we want to make sure that our railroads, since they are so important, that, our employees are taken care of. Well, the strike ends up being incredibly successful. Nobody in the country is riding on a train. They're all shut down. Nobody's able to send any goods or packages, and people can't go anywhere. And here's the thing, is the mail stops getting delivered, because the mail back then, it's not delivered via Pony Express anymore. It's delivered because of the trains. So there is some debate about whether it was the strikers who attached the mail cars, to the train, or whether Pullman hired men, basically guards, to purposely do that to kind of get Debs in trouble. But basically, the mayor of Chicago ends up getting involved, the governor of Illinois ends up getting involved, and they both try to work with Debs and resolve the situation, but Pullman won't budge, he won't give them more money, and nothing's happening. Eventually, what we see happen is that President Grover Cleveland says, you can't stop the U.S. mail, I'm going to send an injunction, you better move those mail cars. And Debs basically ignored the injunction, the court order, which said you have to move the mail cars and get back to work and, get rid of this strike. He wouldn't listen, and so President Cleveland sends in federal troops to come to Pullman, and it's just chaos. I mean, if you send in the army, it's a bad deal. It really is. And the army comes in and they start, using violence to subdue workers, to attack. People get shot and killed. And yeah, it's a sad state of affairs. The American Railway Union is very not powerful after that point. It's not very effective. Eugene Debs ends up going to jail for a while, then he gets out, then he goes back to jail, then he runs for the presidency from jail. And yet again, the common man lost out to big business. They didn't get more money for the employees. Many of the employees got fired and replaced by other people. And it was another sad chapter for labor unions, where robber barons are still definitely in control. That's it for now, guys. Later.